I lay there under her and I wondered what would happen if you could gather all your dark things, if you could bring all the shadows in you together, crush them all in your hands. What would you get? A blank space? A compressed nothingness? Or would it be better and richer, the best and most delicious parts of you, the boiled down essence? Welcome to the Final Girls podcast, where we watch horror films and read horror books. This is Anna, your podcast host, and if this is your first time listening, we usually cover horror film history on the main feed and notable new horror releases over on the Patreon. We've just kicked off our new series, Machines, where we're exploring the intersection of horror films and technology. So expect a lot of creepy killer robots and villainous AI. Alongside our film coverage, every month I interview some of the most exciting people who are writing horror books right now under the banner Bloody Book Club. And my guest this month is Kirsty Logan. She's a Scottish writer of novels and short stories, a book reviewer, freelance editor, and writing mentor. She's also a friend of the pod, and regular listeners will have heard her before on episodes about The Silence of the Lambs and the Hannibal series. The first book of Kirsty's that I picked up was her dark short story collection, Things We Say in the Dark, and was immediately struck by her completely singular voice, both horror and fairy tale infused. Her most recent novel, Now I Am Witch, is a medieval witch revenge quest, and her newest collection of short stories, No and Other Love Stories, is utterly delicious, with each story playing with expectations of horror and love and the erotic. So, suffice to say, I've been an admirer of Kirsty's writing for a bit, and it's an utter pleasure to speak to her about anything, but especially about writing and reading. You can find No and Other Love Stories in all good bookshops now. And with all of that said, please enjoy my conversation with author Kirsty Logan. This feels weird. This feels weird because we've spoken a lot. We've recorded hours together. But this time, I'm interviewing you. Kirsty Logan, Yay! Thank you so much for agreeing to do this.
Thank you. What an absolute treat for me and hopefully for listeners. But if not, we're going to have a nice time.
Have a nice chat about books and about writing and about your new short story collection, No and Other Love Stories, which I loved. And I usually, as you know, ask my guests what their relationship with horror is, but we've done that already when you guested on the show before. So I'm going to reframe it slightly. Do you see yourself as a horror writer?
That's such a good question. Just to be difficult, just to be a bisexual. Yes and no. Yeah, I do, but I don't think that I write traditional horror, and traditional horror is not meant as a dig in any way. I do not like the term elevated horror. We are not on team elevated horror here.
We are not.
I think all horror is beautiful and wonderful. I suppose it's like I never want to say that I'm a poet because I'm like, oh, it just seems like a kind of lofty title that I think saying that I write horror, it seems kind of lofty in some way that I worry that people are going to read it and go, it's not even scary. You're not even writing horror. So I think I write horrible. If not horror, then horrible. And I think I write not romance, but I also think I write romantic things. But they don't necessarily do the things that a romance does. And I think the horror doesn't necessarily do the things that a horror should do.
That's a really interesting answer. So let's dig into that a little bit more. What do you think a horror book aims to do? And what do you want to do with your writing? With your horrible writing?
My horrible writing. I think most of the horror that I like isn't usually shelved in the horror section because it's things that have elements of, I guess, the horrible. You know, people like Shirley Jackson sometimes in the horror section, but really more so just Haunting of Hill House. Like her short stories aren't overt horror. I like, you know, Camilla Gradova, Heather Parry, you know, I'm a nerd for them. Even people like Joan Aiken, who is usually classified as a children's writer, and her books are so weird. They're just so bizarre and strange, and they've got things like people turning into dogs, and they're just really bizarre. So that's the kind of horror that I really like. It's just things with this element of the surreal and the weird, and there aren't necessarily horror tropes. Like there aren't necessarily monsters or serial killers or ghosts, although I do love all of those things. I suppose it's more the uncanny, the unsettling, the eerie is what I like. You know, I love that you called your podcast, your fiction podcast series eerie, because that's what I like. I like things that are just unsettling. They get under your skin and unnerve you rather than outright try and shock or disgust.
I love that. And can you tell me a little bit, and I've always wanted to ask you this, when did you start writing and how do you write? And you can interpret that in any way you want.
So, I mean, I started writing when I was tiny. I used to, when I was a small child, I used to make up plays, like, and force my family to watch me act them out. And I'm so sorry to them.
Oh my God,
I'm so sorry, family. Yeah, terrible plays. And I used to make up stories and write them down, usually about orphans. I was very into like urchins and orphans. Again, Joan Aiken, Wolves of Willoughby Chase was a big influence on me. Things like The Secret Garden, A Little Princess. It was always like waifs, beautiful, sad waifs. So that was a lot of what I wrote. Quite often there was a ghost or some kind of spooky element. So just always, I just love stories. I love writing. I know for a lot of people, my wife included, we've been talking a lot about work and what is work for? What is the purpose of work? How should we feel about work? And she is very good at her job and enjoys her job for the most part, but it's a job. And if they didn't pay her, she wouldn't go. And most of the jobs I've had in my life are like that. I was literally counting the money in my head. Every minute I was like, how much have I earned now? Okay, how much have I earned now? Whereas with writing, if I was cast up on a desert island with no hope of rescue, I would make up stories and write them on the walls, write them in the sand. I just feel like it's who I am as a person. And if everything fell down tomorrow and I couldn't earn a living as a writer, I would simply do another job and write in my own time. I just feel it's who I am. It's who I am as a person.
That's beautiful. And how do you write? We were talking about this a little bit off mic before we started recording. And I find it really interesting, maybe because I'm a stationary nerd and a process person. I just like hearing how people do the things they do, particularly when it is, as you've just been describing, so intertwined with who you are as a person and feel so organic and natural. But tell me about the actual sitting down. Do you need to be in a room? Do you need to write longhand? Do you need to, what is your writing station?
So I think there's the ideal, right? It's like, if I could control the world and everyone in it and time and weather and temperature, this is how I would have my writing situation be. And then there's reality where we control almost none of those things. So over the years, I have taught myself. I mean, this is going to be my 10th book. So I've had a lot of time to try and fail at many, many different approaches and find the ones that work. And I think I've just learned to fit it in where I can, make it work while I can. I've written stories while on train journeys. I don't really like to do that, but sometimes that's what you have to do. I've written a novel, basically 100 words a day, texting it to myself on my phone on my commute.
Shut
That was my
up.
first novel. Yeah, my first novel. That's basically how I wrote it. Because I had to. That's what I had. That's what I had available to me. And now it's very different. Like, I'm a full-time writer. I've got a big, beautiful office with a big desk, which I can spread out on. But I still find myself kind of writing in the spaces and the gaps, because even as I become a full-time writer, other elements of my life have expanded to fill that space. And I kind of joke about this, but it's true. I'm currently writing a novel, which I hope will be book 11, and I'm writing it on Mondays, just Mondays.
Wow.
Because that's what I've got. I've got Mondays. I don't have any other days. If I can find bits and pieces on the other days, then I will. But I know I have Monday. Like, I don't plan anything on Mondays. That's my writing day. And that's just what I have. So I sometimes think, there's this mythical future time where we can just sit and daydream and sit at our big mahogany desks and gaze at the sea. And maybe that does happen, but it probably won't. But it doesn't matter. You can still get the work done. And I've actually noticed my process has changed a lot for this book. So with my other books, I'm a very messy first drafter. So I would just get like the spark of an idea. Like when I started all my novels, actually, I didn't really know how they ended. I kind of knew how they would start. I knew the characters. I kind of knew the journey, but not really. And I just wrote my way into it, did loads and loads of rewriting, cut tens of thousands of words, big mess. Got there in the end. And I don't know what it is, but after having a child who is now 3, it's changed. And I don't know if it's because of that. I don't know if it's because I'm just older. I don't know if I'm just more experienced as a writer. But now I'm a much cleaner drafter. So the stories in No and Other Love Stories, most of them are published almost exactly as I wrote them, with small, very, very small tweaks. But I didn't do any structural rewrites, didn't make any big changes. And it was because I just thought about them for such a long time. I don't know if it's just because as a parent, you don't get a lot of focused time, but you get a huge amount of extremely boring manual task time. You get a lot of time of like pairing up extremely small socks or making spaghetti hoops that aren't going to get eaten, that kind of thing. So you do a lot of like, you can't really do anything else because you have to kind of have half an eye on your child all the time, but you can still think. So I did so much thinking, and I really like lived inside the stories before I wrote them. I made a lot of notes. I did a lot of planning. I planned out the structure really, really carefully. I knew how many words each story was going to be roughly. I knew the shape of it. I don't normally write like that. And I'm kind of doing the same for this new novel, actually. I've only just started it. I'm only about 10,000 words in. And I don't start a chapter until I know exactly what's going to happen in it. And there are still surprises along the way, like characters pop in, or there's a little detail that you didn't think to include, or you suddenly think, oh, I see how this element from a previous chapter is going to tie in nicely here. But I plan it so carefully and so neatly. At the start of each section, I know exactly how long each section is going to be. And I'm like, here's what's going to happen here. And it's going to end on this kind of emotional note, or even it's going to end on this line. And it's so different. And I don't know if is it parenthood? Is it my age? Am I just a more experienced writer? Is it a combination of all of these? I don't know, but I have noticed a real change. And I think that's also part of the writing process, or part of any process in life, that just when we think we've nailed it, things change.
Fascinating. I mean, this is not very helpful for an audio medium, but my mouth was hanging as you were describing knowing the fact that these stories were basically first drafts, and that you knew almost the length of the stories is really, really impressive. And I was wondering as well, because, we were sort of speaking about this, and, I've written only 2 books, and I'm working on the next.
Only 2 books.
Well, you've written 10. You've written 10. I'm fully aware of where I stand. And I was just thinking a lot as you were speaking about that, and how No, you're figuring out what works for you to complete the project in front of you, the book in front of you, and how each book kind of demands its own process a little bit. Like the first one was incredibly messy and frenetic, and the second one was a lot more contained and, you know, bit by bit, and I had specific amount of words that I needed to write every day. And interestingly, you know this because I've done your writing course, but I've started writing fiction, and I found this weird thing happening where I can only write well if I'm writing fiction, if I'm writing longhand. I cannot type it on a computer. But the rest of my work obviously is done on documents and all typed up. And that's the way that I write the essays and the proposals for future books, etc. But I cannot write a short story, and I cannot write any kind of long form fiction. It just stops. I find myself overcorrecting and self-editing as soon as one sentence is done, and it doesn't have that. So the actual stationery, the actually process changes very much depending on the thing that I'm writing. And I wonder, because you've experimented with so many literary forms, like short story collections, you've written novels, you've written a memoir, you've written fiction for audio as well, including the episode that we worked on together for Eerie. How does the different literary form affect your writing at all? The way that you write?
Yeah, it does. And I like that you handwrite fiction, and I think we just have to lean into the way that our brains work. Like, I like to use a particular program, a writing program called Scrivener, and I really like it. It's really easy to kind of move sections of text around. And I started doing that because when I was writing my second novel, I wrote it out of order, and I was driving myself batty, like scrolling up and down on this endless Word document, just being like, where am I? What's happening? I wish I could put this into sections. And then someone said to me, oh, use Scrivener, and it's really easy to put things in sections. And but again, it just suits the way that my brain works. I know plenty of writers who've tried it and thought, oh, I hate this. I just hate the way that this is. So I think we should just lean into it. I'm a big believer, and I'll go into why I say this. Do what's obvious, or like do what's easy. And like, I don't mean like easy in terms of like it's always going to be easiest to just lie on the couch and eat bonbons and like watch Halloween. Like that's always going to be easy, right? So I don't really mean that, because you do have to do the work at some point. But I think, for example, there's a story in my previous collection, Things We Say in the Dark, which is about a world where people become pregnant with different fruits and vegetables.
Yes.
And it just seems so obvious to me, because when you're pregnant, they're like, your baby's the size of a lime, your baby's the size of an apple. So I was like, it seems such an obvious thing then to have you be pregnant with a lime and an apple, that I actually had to go and like look, like Google fruit, baby made of fruit, baby made of vegetables. I mean, I'm not saying no one's ever written that story. Maybe they have. I couldn't find it. And then when I say that to people, they're like, yeah, that's not actually a logical step. And I'm like, it is logical. And I remember reading a Ray Bradbury essay in his book, Zen in the Art of Writing, and he talks about a story he wrote about a man who suddenly becomes terrified of his own skeleton. And he was like, it was such an obvious story. Like, I couldn't believe no one else had written it. And I'm thinking, that's not obvious. I would never write a story about a man who was afraid of his own skeleton. But to Ray Bradbury, very, very obvious. Similarly, in No, there's a story about a teenage girl who becomes sexually obsessed with a female vampire who is eating her period. And again, I had to Google around, like, period vampire eats period. My Google search history is cursed, deeply, deeply cursed. And I was like, I can't believe no one else has done it. I mean, I kind of can believe it, because I know that periods illogically are still hugely taboo in many, many places. So I kind of get why it's not something that we see every single day, but I'm like, it just seems so obvious. Like, part of the problem of being a vampire, surely, is that you kill your food source by eating it. So why wouldn't you use this like renewable food source, which doesn't cause any pain, doesn't cause any damage? There you go, like free blood every single month.
It's sustainable vampirism.
Away. Exactly.
I
Green
love that
vampirism.
story.
Because like it seemed so obvious to me. Like that's such a like a very, very simple logical step to me. Vampires need blood, periods, blood every single month. Why wouldn't you connect those two? And it seems to me like people haven't. And you know what? Maybe they have, and then they've just decided, actually, I'm not going to write that because I find it gross or I find it taboo or something. But I'm just a big believer in like leaning into however your brain works, like whatever process works best for you or whatever type of writing works best for you, do that. Like, why are you trying to push back against what feels right to you? And like, I certainly went through a phase of looking at what do successful writers do? Oh, they get up at this time and they write this many words. Therefore, I will do that. And I think it's fine to experiment because maybe you'll land on something that really works for you. But ultimately, it doesn't matter what Stephen King does. It doesn't matter what any other writer does because their life isn't your life and their brain isn't your brain. So you have to do what suits you best.
You say that beautifully, but I am currently staring at a post-it on my wall right in front of my desk. That is literally a quote from Stephen King about writing 6 clean pages a day.
But like, he can do that because, I'm sorry, he's not cooking the dinner. Whatever he's doing in his life, he doesn't have to do 6 loads of laundry and pair up very small toddler socks. He doesn't have to go and pick up anybody's prescription. I'm sure he does have things in his life, but he has the money and freedom to pay someone to do that for him. And the rest of us simply don't. And like, no shade on him. If I had his money and success, I'd be paying people to do all of my chores as well. So he can do that. But there's no point us comparing our lives to his because they're completely different.
Absolutely. And let's talk a bit more about No and Other Love Stories. You mentioned that you, very differently from your other books, had planned it out all very neatly down to the size of the and the length of the stories. How did this come about? Was it the theme? Was it a particular story that came to you first, and then you built out the collection from there? Tell me a little bit more about how you put it together.
Yeah, it's exactly as you have identified. The first story in the collection is where it all began. And how it came about is that a friend of mine, Heather Parry, friend of yours also,
Brilliant
fabulous writer. Brilliant.
Writer.
Oh, I'm such a nerd for her, honestly. Like, her new book is so good. Like, I'm kind of mad at her about how good it is. It's so annoying, but it is really, really good.
Yes.
Carrion Crow, for anyone who hasn't read it yet.
I'm hoping she'll also do one of these with me.
Oh, I hope so. I can't wait to listen. But she also runs a literary magazine called Extra Teeth. Very good magazine. And for the first issue, several years ago, she commissioned me to write a story for it. And she said, go weird. And I was like, Heather, my work's always weird. You know that. And she was like, yeah, but see the point at which you would usually hold back? Don't hold back. The point at which you would go, no, I can't say that. I can't have that happen. Just do that thing. Like, don't push it for the sake of shock, or like, don't try and be so taboo and whatever. Just do what you would like to do. If you could write anything, write that. And I was like, well, alrighty then. So I did. And I wrote a story about a woman who has a cannibalism fetish, as in she desires to be cannibalized, and she falls in love with a butcher, and she fantasizes about him cannibalizing her. However, that is not how the story goes. I won't say what happens at the end, but it's actually, nobody dies. Nobody is cannibalized. But it's actually, I think, quite a sweet love story. And that's how the whole thing started, is I thought, oh, interesting. I'm really fascinated by this combination of doing something that is quite dark and does touch on some difficult topics, but that doesn't mean it has to be grim. I can't stand a grim horror. It's just not to my taste. It's not my cup of tea. There's room for everyone in the world, and there's room for every kind of story. So I'm not saying they shouldn't exist. I'm just saying they're not to my taste. They're not my cup of soup. And I just don't like them. I don't like really, really depressing, downbeat stories where everybody hates each other and there's no passion or hope. But I also I don't like cutesiness, really. I feel like I always think I have quite a high tolerance for cute, and I actually don't. I'm actually like, I'm a goth at heart, but I'm an optimistic goth. Can that be a thing? That I like stories that get very dark and push a boundary a little bit, but I don't know. I don't really write violence particularly. I don't really write gore or torture. I don't like to write sexual assault, certainly not for no purpose. If there's a hint of sexual assault, then there has to be a very strong thematic reason. Like, you don't just chuck that in for fun. Like, that's a serious and very upsetting topic. So I feel like you have to earn that. So I want to make sure that I earn any kind of difficult subjects that I'm bringing up. So yeah, that was a long answer. That's where the whole book came from, is Heather saying to me, at the point that you would normally stop, don't. And that's kind of what I did with all the stories is, again, I at no point sat down and thought, do you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to be really shocking. I'm just going to shock everyone. I don't care. I don't care for that personally. I think we all had that phase when we were 14 and I got it out of my system when I was 14. So I'm not trying to push a taboo for the sake of it. I'm not trying to shock anyone for the sake of it. I'm simply telling a story that I think is true and honest and is not holding back in a way that I would normally hold back. So this is, I think, a very, very honest book, I hope.
And out of the stories in there, is there any one that was particularly special to write or even challenging to finish?
Yes. The most challenging one, I think, was one that's called Darling. And it's got quite an unusual format, that it's written as an annotated script. So I really, really enjoyed writing this one. So the kind of main body of the text is a script, which is, as anyone will be able to tell, heavily based on Law and Order SVU, Special Victims Unit.
As an SVU head, the way that that story is I mean, the format, which I'm really excited to hear about because it's quite an interesting layout, but I appreciated it very much.
Yeah, I have seen probably every episode of SVU. And sometimes I stop and think, it's like true crime. That we all, maybe not all, the majority of us enjoy true crime. And then we stop and think, it's so weird that this is entertainment. And I sometimes think that about SVU, a massively successful TV show. It's gone on for 20 seasons or something? It's gone on for decades. On the
26th season, I believe.
You are kidding, 26!
Hold on, let me just check.
Oh my goodness. No, you're probably right. Oh, there's just so many seasons. And then, it's a massive like primetime TV show. And it's basically like mostly women being raped for our entertainment. And I sometimes think like, that's weird. And like, I'm not judging anyone. I enjoy it just as much as anybody else does. I enjoy that it brings up important issues sometimes. Sometimes it doesn't handle things very well, but sometimes it does handle things well and brings things up. But I was really fascinated by that. The fact that like rape as primetime entertainment, fascinating concept in itself. So the main body of it is it's not taken from a real SVU script. I did like wrote my own version of a show similar that's called Darling, about Meredith Darling, the detective. And the other story is that the actress who plays Meredith Darling is annotating this script because she intends to kind of sell it as a piece of memorabilia. But then it's her much older. She's now making a horror film, a very, very low budget horror film out in the middle of nowhere. And she starts to become suspicious of the nature of this film and the harm that could potentially come to her while making this film, and also what her husband may or may not have to do with it. So it was a challenge to write because I have a genuine love for like a by the numbers procedural TV show. Like I love ER, I love SVU. At times I love CSI. Like I do like these kind of formulaic TV shows. So in writing the script, I had to be quite deadpan, and I tried to make it feel like a real script. Like it's not tongue-in-cheek. It's not knowing. It's not kind of taking the piss out of the genre. It's meant to be quite a genuine piece of the genre. And then it's quite hard to then tell a story in the footnotes. And I don't know if I fully achieved what I wanted to achieve, but I did the best that I could. And that's all any of us can say, really.
I found that story a really interesting read, because you can read it twice and read it in different ways. You can read it multiple times and extract different readings of it. But just playing around with how the text itself is laid out on a page is something that I've noticed in other books of yours, especially in your latest novel, Now She Is a Witch. There's a lot of playfulness with how the actual text is laid out on the page, which really changes the way that we as readers interact with that story. And with that story, I loved it as a fellow SVU and Olivia Benson head, but this particular experience was like you're in the character's head, but also following this plot. And at the same time, this show is running, the script is unfolding in front of you, and you're reading it both as its own world, but also through the eyes of the character who's meant to perform it. And I think it's one of the most formally exciting pieces in the book, in my opinion.
Oh, thank you. I like to play around with form and language. And again, much like I'm not intending to, push a boundary or address a taboo, I'm not really trying to be experimental or be difficult. I have such a high level of respect for the reader. And I think reading is a very collaborative act, that the writer has to give you enough to go on, but the reader brings themselves to the book as well. Even just by its very nature, you can't really passively read. You have to actively read the words, create the image in your mind, or if you don't do that, to kind of create the story in whatever way that you do. So it does involve, you can't really do it passively. So I just find reading to be such a magical thing. I'm a big film and TV nerd as well. I love games. I love art. I love many, many different types of narrative and media. But reading to me is so special because it's so vivid in my mind. And I hold the books I have read so vividly inside my mind in a way that other media just doesn't get me the same way. I don't feel like I inhabit it in the same way. And I do think partly it is the fact that it is an active form of entertainment, I think. Not necessarily more so than all other forms of entertainment, but it definitely is a very strongly interactive type of experiencing things. And I just like to give the reader something to play with. I like to leave space for the reader, because you can choose how you read that. You can choose, do you read the script all the way through and then go back and read the footnotes, or do you kind of go back and forth the whole way, which gives you a really different, staccato-esque experience, as if you're trying to watch something and somebody's continually interrupting you as you're watching it. But then the reader gets to choose. And I really like that. And I don't ever want to be difficult for the sake of difficulty. I really think, I hope, even my more experimental pieces of writing or the unusual formats, they're not difficult to understand. I think any reader really can follow my writing and understand what's going on. So I don't ever want to be hoity-toity or you need an advanced literature degree to understand what I'm doing here. I'm really not trying to do that. I just like to play. I don't like when things talk to me like I'm an idiot, you know? Sometimes you come back to a TV show and they assume that you've nipped off to make a cup of tea and you've missed a bit, or you've been looking at your phone, and they sort of remind you. I watched a show that genuinely, it was like a murder mystery show, and if it mentioned a character that you hadn't seen for a while, they would flash up on the screen the last time that you saw them, and you're like, I know, I remember, because I'm paying attention. And I don't like when they assume that you're not paying attention, or they assume that you're a bit thick. I don't like that. I like when things hold me in high respect as a reader or as a viewer. But I also don't like when they talk to me like they're smarter than me. I don't really like when things are to so difficult or so complicated that at the end of a long day, you think, oh God, homework. Do I really have to do this? So I feel like I try and strike a balance between like, you know, it's because it's not fun to do something that's too easy. You know, nobody wants to do like a puzzle that is for a child, unless you are a child, obviously. You don't want to do like a puzzle that's made for a toddler because you're not a toddler. So it's too easy and it's boring. But you also don't want to do a puzzle like, I cannot do a cryptic crossword. I don't want to do that. That's too hard. I want something that's like challenging, but I can still do it. And so to me, that's the kind of books that I enjoy as well. And that's what I try and give is like, I'm going to challenge you a little bit, but I think it'll be fun. And I don't think it'll be too difficult at all.
It's absolutely not. And I wonder as well, what do you think of this intersection of the erotic, the romantic, and the horrific or the horrible, which is a place where I think a lot of the stories of this collection in particular, but also some of your previous short stories also live. And it's an area that I find very, very fascinating and where some of my favorite films and fiction in a horror space exist.
I also find it really fascinating, and it makes perfect sense to me. I actually taught a class recently on horror and romance, and they might not seem to go together, but I think they go together really, really well because they're both, more so I think than, I was going to say any other genre except maybe comedy, they are intending to produce an emotional reaction and almost like, without being too graphic, like a physical reaction, right? When you find something like romantic or sexy, like your heart beats faster. When you find something scary, like you might get sweaty palms or nervous. If you find something funny, then you laugh out loud. You want to produce a reaction. It's all about, this is what I'm saying, how it's interactive, it's collaborative. It's almost like you're sitting like peering at the reader saying, are you reacting? Like, what do you think? Is this working? And I just think that they connect together really, really well. And I don't really think of them as like erotic horror because I think that is its own genre and that's not what I'm doing. I just think there are so many intersections of, I don't even want to say like erotica and horror or romance and horror. I'm going to say like desire and fear, or like desire and shock, or desire and trepidation. I think quite often they're both about taboos and what we don't want to say. And I think when it comes to things, when we try and describe the things that we're afraid of, it can sound quite silly. So I teach a lot of horror classes, and one of the things that I do is get people to talk about the things that frighten them as a child. And we always do it in a slightly funny way, like, personally, I was frightened by the Muppets, you know, things like that. Yeah. And it seems really silly and like you kind of mock yourself, but like it also isn't silly. It's also really real. Like when you're in that place, and I think so many horror films, like if you watch them in full daylight with a bunch of friends eating popcorn and taking a piss, like it's not scary, it's funny. And similarly, like if you watch something that's erotic with your friends, then it's not really sexy. Like it's silly. And I think like for all of us, every single one of us who has any kind of like sex drive or fantasy, if we were to say the things that we say in intimate moments in like full daylight, like over a coffee with a friend, like it would just be so awful. Like it's just going to seem so cringe, so ridiculous, like maybe even shocking. But in the moment, it's not, because it's all about being in that place, being in that imaginative, fantastical place. And so much of horror, and I think like romance / erotica / desire narratives, it's about things that can only really make sense in that almost dream space, or that place where you're not in full daylight, you're not sitting in the coffee shop, you're not washing the dishes, you're in some other place. Even if physically you are washing the dishes, you know, in your mind, you're somewhere else. And I think that's what really fascinates me. It's this kind of like liminal, twilighty, not quite real space. And I think both desire and fear live there.
Oh, I love that. They're like inhabitants of the same liminal space, which for me is always a hotel room.
Oh, right? Yeah. And hotel rooms are so creepy.
But also sexy.
A lot of sex.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Kirsty, as we wrap up, outside of your own, are there any other horror books, be that novels or short stories, that you would recommend people seek out?
Oh, so many. Well, I'm sure everybody's read Anna's book, Feeding the Monster. Love it. So good. I've already mentioned Heather Parry. I really love Carrion Crow, which is just out. Also, there's a debut by Lucy Rose called The Lamb, which I loved. And it's about a mother-daughter cannibal duo. So, if we're talking about taboos, like, that's a real taboo. But again, much like in No, it's not kind of done for shock value, because it's very much about like desire in a romantic sexual sense, but also just the desire for belonging, the desire for power. And I think that's what really interests me. That's what interests me in all of the books that I mentioned are very much about bodies, the control of bodies. It's about where does the power lie in a particular relationship. I think all of the stories in No are about power in certain ways. And I'm really fascinated, actually. One of the stories in No, I can't say too much about it, but it's been optioned for film by a production company that made a film that I didn't really like. So I'm not going to say too much about it. But the story, I'm so curious to see if it, you know what it's like when things are optioned, don't hold your breath, essentially. Yep. It might happen or it might not. And the story is about a woman who becomes obsessed. There's lots of obsession in this book, as you can tell, with her neighbors across the road, who are a young, attractive man and a much older woman. And she can't figure out what the relationship is between them, mother and son, or like sugar mama, like what is it? And it turns out, I'll spoil the story, it turns out that the man kidnapped the woman when she was 14, killed her entire family and kidnapped her. And he is a vampire. He is an eternal, ageless vampire. And she is a human, so she continues to age. And every day he asks her if he can vampirize her, because he didn't require her consent to murder her entire family and kidnap her, but he does require her consent to vampirize her. And the only piece of power that she has over him is to say no. And actually in the book, if there are any nerds who like to solve little literary puzzles, although this isn't a complicated one, in every one of the stories, somebody says the word no as an act of love. As an act of love to someone else, or as an act of love to themselves. So in each story, no is used in that way. So in that story, that's how no is used, that she chooses to grow old and die because that's the only power that she has left. And I'm like, oh, somebody could make such an interesting film out of that, but someone could also make a terrible film. So we'll see. We'll see which way it goes.
And thank you so much for your time. It's such a pleasure to listen to you talk about the way that you write, and about books, and about the process and your approach to horror and to storytelling. Just a joy. And can you please tell the listeners where they can find more of your work, whether that's in print or online?
Yes. Well, I have now 10 books, so plenty of my strange little brain to inhabit if you choose to. Probably for horror readers, Things We Say in the Dark will be the one of choice. But if you're more of a novel person, then Now She Is Witch might be the one for you. I'm very easy to find online. I am Kirsty Logan on everything, basically. And also my website is kirstylogan.com. And I spend far too long on social media, so you can find me there if you want to.
Thank you so much.